Welcome to Scarelax, where chilling tales and soothing tones merge to create the perfect escape for your imagination. Each episode, we bring you an immersive horror story designed to be both scary and relaxing, a unique blend that's perfect for your bedtime escape. The stories in this series are inspired by real folk tales from the countries they're set in, weaving cultural myths and legends into modern, chilling narratives. Tonight's tale is inspired by the Japanese legend of the Yūrei, vengeful spirits bound to the mortal world by sorrow and unfinished business. Their haunting presence has shaped Japan's ghostly folklore for centuries. If you enjoy letting your imagination wander into the shadows from the safety of your own bed, be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. Tonight's story is the first in our Terror Abroad series, set against the vibrant yet enigmatic streets of modern-day Tokyo. It delves into the haunting echoes of Japan's ghostly folklore. We follow Marcus, a photographer seeking inspiration in the neon-lit alleys of the city. When his camera captures something not visible to the naked eye, Marcus finds himself entangled with a restless Yūrei, a spirit bound by sorrow and vengeance. What begins as a quest for the perfect shot spirals into a chilling confrontation with the supernatural. In this shadowed journey, Marcus must uncover the truth of the Yūrei's torment, or risk becoming a part of it. Now, dim the lights, settle in, and let's travel to Japan to see the ghost in the frame. The streets of Shinjuku pulsed with life, the kaleidoscope of neon signs casting reflections on the rain-slicked pavement. The familiar hum of the city surrounded Marcus as he wandered through the maze of alleyways. To a tourist, this was Tokyo's energy at its peak, a whirlwind of sound, color, and light. But for Marcus, a Japanese-speaking permanent resident, this was his battlefield for creativity. He adjusted the strap of his camera, its weight a constant companion. As a freelance photographer, Marcus had come to Tokyo in search of inspiration, but the city's overwhelming brightness had yet to yield the kind of shot that would make his portfolio sing. Tonight, though, he had resolved to stay out until he found something worth capturing. The crowd thinned as he ventured deeper into the back streets. The vibrant glow of the main roads gave way to dimly lit alleys lined with vending machines, small bars, and shuttered storefronts. It was here, in the shadows, that Tokyo began to feel alive in a different way. Quieter, but somehow more watchful. Marcus paused beside a cracked wall plastered with faded advertisements. He lifted his camera and framed the shot. The contrast between the peeling posters and the flickering fluorescent light created a perfect composition. Satisfied, Marcus reviewed the image on the display. The posters and light were as he'd envisioned, but something in the frame gave him pause. Near the corner of the shot, almost imperceptible, was a faint blur, something out of place. He frowned, adjusted the settings, and took another photo. This time, the blur was clearer. It was a figure, a pale silhouette standing just at the edge of the light. "What the hell?" Marcus whispered. He lowered the camera and squinted toward the alley. Nothing was there, just the empty space illuminated by a flickering light. A chill crept down his spine, but he shook it off. It was probably a trick of the light, or maybe the lens had caught a smear he hadn't noticed earlier. Wiping the lens carefully, he stepped further into the alley. The air grew colder, the distant hum of the city fading into an eerie quiet. Marcus felt a subtle shift in the atmosphere, as though the alley were holding its breath. He raised his camera again, focused on a rusted bicycle leaning against a wall. The moment the flash went off, the shadows seemed to deepen. Marcus checked the display and froze. The figure was there again, more distinct this time. It was a woman, her long black hair hanging over her face, her body wrapped in a white, tattered robe. She stood just behind the bicycle, her head tilted slightly to the side. "Okay, that's not normal," Marcus muttered, his heartbeat quickening. He turned back toward the mouth of the alley, but it felt farther away than it should have been. The walls seemed taller, the shadows darker. Marcus forced himself to breathe deeply, gripping his camera as though it might protect him. "Just one more shot," he said aloud, his voice shaky. Raising the camera, he pointed it toward the spot where the figure had appeared. The alley was empty, but he pressed the shutter anyway. This time, the flash illuminated the entire alley for a split second, and in that moment, Marcus saw her. She was standing only a few feet away, her face obscured by her hair. The camera slipped from his hands, the strap catching it before it hit the ground. Marcus stumbled back, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Who's there?" he called, his voice echoing unnaturally in the narrow space. The figure didn't move, but the air grew colder still. Marcus's hands trembled as he fumbled with his camera, instinctively reviewing the last photo. She was there, impossibly close, her head tilted upward as though she were looking directly at him through the lens. Marcus turned and ran, the sound of his footsteps drowned out by a sudden piercing wail that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. He didn't stop until he reached the crowded streets of Shinjuku, where the bright lights and bustling crowds felt alien after the oppressive silence of the alley. Clutching his camera tightly, Marcus glanced back toward the alley. It was empty now, just another forgotten corner of the city. But he couldn't shake the feeling that he had been seen, not by the lens, but through it. And whoever, or whatever, had seen him wasn't done. Marcus sat at the tiny desk in his rented Shinjuku apartment. The camera rested on the table before him like an artifact from a distant world. The room was sparse, with bare walls and minimal furnishings, but tonight it felt suffocating. The air was thick with unease, as if the events of the alley had followed him home. He hesitated before turning on his laptop. He wasn't sure he wanted to see the photographs again, but the rational part of his mind insisted that there had to be an explanation. A trick of the light, a lens flare, or perhaps even a person lingering just out of sight. The laptop screen glowed to life, and Marcus connected the camera. As the photos uploaded, he scrolled through the thumbnails, his pulse quickening when he reached the first image from the alley. The figure was faint in the first shot, a barely discernible blur. But in the subsequent images, she became clearer, her presence undeniable. By the final photo, she was almost fully formed, her pale face partially obscured by long black hair. Marcus leaned closer to the screen, his breath shallow. Her face, what little he could see of it, was unnerving. The skin was unnaturally pale, and her eyes, though shadowed, seemed to pierce through the screen, locking onto his own. He zoomed in on the last photo, focusing on her obscured features. As he adjusted the resolution, he noticed something that made his stomach drop. The faint outline of her mouth was twisted into a small, almost imperceptible smile. A chill ran through him, and he pulled back from the screen. It felt wrong, like the image was watching him, aware of his scrutiny. Marcus rubbed his temples, trying to shake the growing sense of dread. "It's just a picture," he muttered to himself, "just pictures on a screen." But even as he said it, he felt the weight of her gaze. That night, Marcus dreamed of the alley. In the dream, it was impossibly long, the walls stretching upward into a dark, infinite void. He stood at the center, his camera heavy in his hands. The air was cold, the kind of chill that seeped into his bones. The figure appeared at the far end, her form flickering like a shadow caught between two worlds. She moved toward him slowly, her feet gliding soundlessly over the ground. Marcus tried to raise his camera, but his arms wouldn't respond. He stood frozen as she approached, her head tilting as though studying him. When she was close enough to touch, she leaned forward, her hair parting slightly to reveal empty, hollow eyes. "You saw me," she whispered, her voice echoing like a chorus of broken glass. Marcus woke with a start, his chest heaving. The room was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of his laptop screen. He reached for his phone to check the time, 3:33 a.m. As he sat up, trying to calm his racing heart, a faint sound reached his ears. He froze, his blood running cold. The sound was unmistakable, the click of a camera shutter. "Hello?" he called out, his voice trembling. The room was silent. He scanned the darkness, his eyes darting to every shadow, every corner. The camera sat untouched on the desk, the lens cap securely in place. The sound came again, this time closer. Marcus grabbed his phone, fumbling to turn on the flashlight. The beam of light swept across the room, revealing nothing out of the ordinary. But when he turned back to the desk, his breath caught. The camera was on, the lens cap was off, and the display showed a live feed of the room. In the frame, Marcus could see himself, sitting on the bed, his phone in hand. But behind him, just at the edge of the frame, was the figure. She stood motionless, her head tilted, her black hair obscuring her face. Marcus spun around, the flashlight shaking in his hand. The room was empty. He turned back to the camera, his hands trembling as he picked it up. The live feed was gone, replaced by a single photograph. It showed Marcus sitting on the bed, staring into the camera. The figure was closer now, standing directly behind him, her hair brushing his shoulder. His phone slipped from his hand, clattering to the floor. The faint sound of a whisper filled the room. The whisper grew louder, faint and indistinct, like a distant wind carrying fragmented words. Marcus sat frozen, the glow of his laptop casting an eerie light across his pale face. The photograph still filled the camera's display screen, the image of himself sitting on the bed, the Yūrei standing just behind him. He didn't dare look over his shoulder. "Who are you?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. The room answered with silence. Then the whispering began again, this time clearer. It wasn't a single voice. It was a chorus, layered and overlapping, speaking words he couldn't fully understand. Marcus grabbed the camera, his hands trembling, and turned it off. He shut the laptop and slid it under the desk, as though creating distance would protect him. The whispers stopped. The room was silent again, but the oppressive weight in the air remained, wrapping around him like a shroud. By morning, the events of the night felt like a fever dream, hazy and surreal. Marcus convinced himself it was exhaustion playing tricks on his mind. He left the camera untouched on the desk and stepped out into the bustling streets of Tokyo, hoping the city's energy would ground him. As he wandered through Shinjuku's labyrinthine streets, Marcus felt the weight of unease linger at the back of his mind. The neon signs, so vibrant and chaotic, seemed dimmer somehow. The shadows between the buildings stretched farther, darker. He stopped at a coffee shop and ordered a drink, sitting by the window as he scrolled through his phone. The notifications and messages felt mundane, grounding him to reality. But when he opened his gallery, his stomach dropped. The photo was there, him on the bed, the Yūrei behind him. Marcus's hand shook as he stared at the image. He hadn't transferred it to his phone. It shouldn't have been there. His thumb hovered over the delete button, but he hesitated. Part of him didn't want to touch it, as if doing so would invite her back. He closed the gallery app and slipped his phone into his pocket, suddenly feeling watched. As night fell, Marcus found himself back in his apartment. The camera still sat on the desk, its lens cap securely in place. He avoided looking at it, but his mind wouldn't let go of the photograph. Finally, he gave in. He powered on the laptop and connected the camera, pulling up the images again. The thumbnails appeared as they had before, but something was different this time. The final photo, the one with the Yūrei behind him, was subtly altered. She was closer now. Her hand rested on his shoulder, and her face was more visible, though her features remained blurred like a half-forgotten memory. Marcus's breath quickened. He leaned in closer, studying the photo. The longer he stared, the more he noticed. Her hair wasn't just covering her face. It was moving, curling and twisting like smoke. As he zoomed in further, the whispers began again, faint at first, then louder. Marcus. His name emerged from the chorus, clear and distinct. He shot back from the desk, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. A laptop screen flickered. The photograph disappeared, replaced by a live feed from the camera. The Yūrei was in the frame again, standing at the far corner of the room, her head tilted, her hair swaying unnaturally. Marcus turned slowly, his heart pounding. The corner was empty. He turned back to the screen, and she was closer. Marcus. The whisper came again, louder now. His pulse thundered in his ears as he stumbled back, knocking the chair over. "What do you want?" he shouted, his voice cracking. The screen flickered, the live feed replaced by text. The words appeared slowly, one at a time, as though written by an invisible hand. "You saw me." Marcus's vision blurred as panic set in. He slammed the laptop shut, grabbed the camera, and threw it into a drawer, slamming it shut. The whisper stopped, but the room didn't feel any safer. He sat on the edge of his bed, his head in his hands, trying to steady his breathing. The events of the past few days felt like a waking nightmare, and he had no idea how to escape it. As he sat in the heavy silence, his phone buzzed in his pocket. Marcus pulled it out, his stomach sinking when he saw the notification. New photo uploaded. Marcus.jpg. Marcus stared at his phone, his breath shallow. The notification lingered on the screen, stark against the dim light of his room. New photo uploaded. Marcus.jpg. He hesitated, his finger trembling over the notification. Against every instinct, he tapped it. The screen opened to his gallery, and there it was, a photo he hadn't taken. It was an image of him in his apartment, sitting at his desk. The shot was from above, as though taken from the ceiling. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear as he stared into his laptop. Marcus's hand shook. He had been alone in the room. Or so he thought. The shadows in the corners seemed to stretch, and for a moment he swore he saw movement. He shot to his feet, grabbing his phone and jacket. He couldn't stay in the apartment 1 minute longer. The night air was cold as Marcus wandered the streets of Shinjuku. The bustling crowds and neon lights felt surreal, like a fever dream he couldn't wake from. He checked over his shoulder constantly, convinced that the Yūrei was following him. He found himself at a bar tucked into a quiet alley. The dimly lit space was filled with the low murmur of patrons and the occasional clink of glasses. Marcus slid into a booth in the corner, his back to the wall. He needed answers. He opened his phone and searched for information about ghostly encounters in Tokyo. The results were overwhelming, a mix of urban legends, historical accounts, and horror stories. And one word appeared repeatedly: Yūrei. Restless spirits tied to the mortal world by unresolved emotions. They were often women bound by sorrow, vengeance, or tragedy. Marcus felt a chill as he read further. The legends said that the Yūrei would latch onto those who noticed them, those who saw them when they weren't meant to be seen. You saw me. Her words echoed in his mind. His breath quickened as he scrolled through articles, trying to find something, anything, that could help him sever the connection. One account stood out. It told of a Yūrei bound to a specific location, unable to leave until someone acknowledged the pain that had tied them to the world. Only by confronting the spirit's torment could they be set free. Marcus frowned, his thoughts racing. The alley, the photographs, it all seemed to lead back there. He drained his drink and left the bar, his determination outweighing his fear. The alley looked the same as it had that night. The flickering fluorescent light cast long shadows on the cracked pavement, and the air was colder than it should have been. Marcus gripped his camera tightly as he stepped into the shadows. The oppressive silence enveloped him immediately, muting the distant hum of the city. "Okay," he whispered to himself. "You want me to see you? I'm here." He raised the camera, framing the alley in the viewfinder. The flash illuminated the space for a brief moment, but it was enough. She was there, at the far end of the alley, her pale form flickering like a dying light. "Who are you?" Marcus called out, his voice echoing unnaturally. The Yūrei didn't move, but the whispers began again, louder this time. They seemed to come from every direction, surrounding him. He took a step forward, his heart pounding. The camera felt heavy in his hands, but it was his only connection to her. "I know you're angry," he said, his voice trembling. "I know you're in pain. Tell me what happened. Let me help you." The whispers grew into a low, mournful wail. Marcus raised the camera again, snapping another photo. The flash revealed her face, partially obscured by her hair. Her eyes, hollow and lifeless, seemed to bore into him. As the light faded, she moved. One moment she was at the far end of the alley, and the next she was only a few feet away. Marcus stumbled back, nearly dropping the camera. "Please," he whispered, "what do you want from me?" Her head tilted, and her voice emerged from the cacophony of whispers, soft, almost pleading. "Remember." The word sent a chill through him, and before he could respond, the alley was empty again. The whispers ceased, leaving an impressive silence in their wake. Marcus stood frozen, the camera still clutched in his trembling hands. He didn't understand what she wanted, but he knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. Marcus sat at his desk, staring at the photos on his laptop. Each one was a fragment of the Yūrei's presence, her faint outline in the shadows, her distorted form moving closer, her face half revealed through the dark veil of her hair. The words she had spoken echoed in his mind. Remember. But remember what? The camera sat beside him, its lens pointed toward the wall. It felt like a watchful eye, silently urging him forward. Marcus clicked through the photos again, looking for any detail he might have missed. One of the images caught his attention. In the photo where the Yūrei stood closest, something was etched on the wall behind her. Symbols, faint and worn. Marcus hadn't noticed them before. He leaned closer, zooming in. The symbols were kanji, but their age and erosion made them difficult to decipher. He grabbed his phone and snapped a picture of the screen, then ran a search. The results were fragmented, but a pattern emerged. The kanji referenced grief, abandonment, and loss. One article linked them to a small shrine once located in Shinjuku, long forgotten beneath the city's rapid development. The shrine had been a place of mourning for those who had died unjustly, murder victims, betrayed lovers, and others whose spirits couldn't find peace. Marcus's stomach sank. Could the Yūrei be tied to this shrine? Was it her torment that had anchored her to the alley? The next morning, Marcus retraced his steps, armed with his camera and a notebook full of hastily written translations. He walked through the labyrinth of Shinjuku's back streets, his eyes scanning every detail. It took hours, but he found it. The alley was hidden behind a chain-link fence and overgrown weeds. At the end, a crumbling stone torii gate marked the remnants of a shrine. The air was thick with an unnatural stillness, the hum of the city fading as Marcus stepped through the gate. The shrine was no longer recognizable, just a stone pedestal surrounded by fragments of wood and faded offerings. Marcus knelt, brushing away debris to reveal a weathered plaque. The kanji was barely legible, but Marcus could make out a name. Yumi. He whispered it aloud, the sound lingering in the still air. Yumi, is that you? The whispers returned, faint at first, then growing louder. Marcus froze as the air grew colder, the shadows deepening around him. She appeared before him, her form flickering like a distorted video. Her head tilted as she stared at him, her long black hair shifting like tendrils of smoke. Marcus's voice shook. Yumi, I found your shrine. I found your name. Tell me what happened. The whispers intensified, but within the cacophony, he could hear fragments of her story, scattered broken words that painted a tragic picture. Betrayed, forgotten, alone. The pieces fell into place. Yumi had been wronged, her life stolen from her by someone she trusted. Her shrine had been abandoned, her memory erased by time. I'm sorry, Marcus said, his voice trembling. I'm so sorry for what happened to you. I see you now. I remember you. The Yūrei's form flickered, her face turning upward as though searching for something. The whispers softened, and for a moment, Marcus thought he saw a glimmer of peace in her hollow eyes. But it was fleeting. Her head snapped back toward him, her hair whipping violently. You must finish it, her voice rasped, clear and sharp. Finish what? Marcus shouted, his heart pounding. The whispers surged again, and Marcus stumbled backward as the Yūrei reached for him. Her touch was icy, sending a jolt of pain through his body. As the world around him blurred, her voice echoed in his mind. Finish what they started. Marcus woke on the cold ground, his camera lying beside him. The shrine was silent, the whispers gone. He knew what he had to do. The next evening, Marcus returned to the alley with a determination that burned through his fear. The air was colder than before, and the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally, reaching for him as he stepped closer to the remains of the shrine. He carried offerings he had hurriedly gathered that afternoon, incense, flowers, and a candle. These small items felt insignificant, but they were all he could think to bring to honor the memory of Yumi, the spirit bound to this place. Placing the items on the crumbling pedestal, Marcus lit the incense and candle, their faint glow casting flickering shadows on the broken stone. He knelt, his voice steady despite the lump of his... He carried offerings he had hurriedly gathered that afternoon, incense, flowers, and a candle. These small items felt insignificant, but they were all he could think to bring to honor the memory of Yumi, the spirit bound to this place. Placing the items on the crumbling pedestal, Marcus lit the incense and candle, their faint glow casting flickering shadows on the broken stone. He knelt, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat. Yumi, he began, I've come to remember you, to make sure you're not forgotten. The air grew colder, and the whispers began, swirling around him like a spectral wind. He could feel her presence heavy and unrelenting. She emerged from the shadows, her pale form flickering in the dim light of the candle. Her hair shifted, revealing her face fully for the first time. Her features were twisted in anguish. Her hair shifted, revealing her face fully for the first time. Her features were twisted in anguish, her eyes hollow and filled with sorrow. Marcus's breath hitched, but he didn't look away. "You were betrayed," he said softly. "Your life was stolen and your memory was erased. I'm here to make it right." The whispers softened, turning almost mournful. Yumi tilted her head, her gaze locked onto Marcus. "How can I help you?" he asked. Her voice came low and rasping but clear. "Justice." Marcus frowned. "I don't know who hurt you. I don't know where to start." The whisper swirled, and Yumi raised a hand, pointing toward the far end of the alley. The darkness seemed to ripple, and Marcus saw something he had noticed before: a rusted metal door partially obscured by debris. He hesitated, glancing back at Yumi. Her form flickered, her gaze unwavering. Taking a deep breath, Marcus moved toward the door. The metal groaned as he pushed it open, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. The air inside was heavy and damp, carrying the scent of mildew and decay. With his flashlight trembling in his hand, Marcus descended. At the bottom of the stairs, he found himself in a small, forgotten storage room. Broken furniture and discarded papers littered the floor, and the walls were stained with age. In the center of the room stood a single wooden chest, its surface covered in dust and cobwebs. Marcus approached cautiously, his footsteps echoing in the confined space. He knelt beside it and lifted the lid. Inside, he found a collection of items: a silk scarf, a small journal, and an ornate hairpin. The sight of these personal belongings made his chest tighten. They must have belonged to Yumi. He opened the journal carefully, its pages brittle with age. The handwriting was delicate, each word written with care. As he read, the story unfolded. Yumi had been betrayed by someone she loved, a lover who had taken her life in a jealous rage. Her death had been covered up, and her belongings hidden in this forgotten room. Marcus felt a surge of anger and sorrow as he pieced the story together. This wasn't just a haunting. It was a cry for justice, a demand to be seen and remembered. He gathered the items from the chest, his hands shaking. "Yumi," he whispered, "I'll make sure they know. I'll tell your story." The whispers returned, soft and almost soothing. Marcus turned to see Yumi standing at the foot of the stairs, her form less distorted, her presence less oppressive. She nodded slowly, her eyes glinting in the faint light. Back in the alley, Marcus placed Yumi's belongings on the shrine. He lit fresh incense and knelt before the pedestal, bowing his head. "I'll make sure you're remembered," he said. "Your story won't be forgotten." The air grew still, and for a moment, the city's distant hum returned. When Marcus looked up, Yumi was gone. The alley felt different now, lighter, as though a weight had been lifted. He stood, his legs unsteady, and turned toward the bustling streets of Shinjuku. But as he walked away, he couldn't shake the feeling that her story wasn't over. In the days following his confrontation with Yumi, Marcus felt a change, not just in the air around him, but within himself. The weight of fear had been lifted, replaced by a quiet determination. Yumi's story wasn't just hers anymore. It was his responsibility to tell. Sitting at his desk, Marcus carefully laid out the items he had taken from the chest: the silk scarf, the ornate hairpin, and the fragile journal. He spent hours poring over the entries, piecing together the fragments of Yumi's life and the betrayal that had anchored her spirit to the alley. The final pages of the journal had been the hardest to read. They spoke of a love turned sour, of jealousy and violence that had ended in her tragedy. Her final entry was a desperate plea for someone to remember her, to ensure that her life and her suffering wouldn't be erased. Marcus opened his laptop, the soft glow illuminating the darkened room. He began typing, his words spilling onto the screen as he recounted everything: the photographs, the whispers, the shrine, and the truth hidden in the shadows. He didn't know who would read it, but he knew he had to try. By the time Marcus finished, the sun was rising, its light filtering through the curtains. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. The article was raw, emotional, and honest. It included photographs of the shrine and translations of Yumi's journal entries. He hesitated only briefly before hitting publish. The article gained traction quickly. Comments flooded in from readers, many expressing sympathy for Yumi and anger at the injustice of her death. Others shared stories of similar hauntings, of restless spirits bound by unresolved pain. But one comment stood out among the rest. "I know this story. My grandmother used to tell me about a woman named Yumi who was wronged by a man she loved. She said the shrine was built for her by the local community, but it was abandoned after the area was redeveloped. Thank you for bringing this back into the light." Marcus felt a chill as he read the words. Yumi's memory had been preserved, even if only faintly, through the whispers of history. Now, her story had a new audience. That night, Marcus returned to the alley. The shrine was quiet, its stones bathed in the soft glow of the city lights. He knelt before it, placing fresh incense and flowers on the pedestal. "Yumi," he said softly, "you're not forgotten anymore. I hope you found peace." The air around him felt warm, almost comforting. For the first time since the haunting began, there was no oppressive chill, no whispers clawing at the edge of his hearing. As he stood to leave, Marcus glanced back at the shrine one last time. For a brief moment, he thought he saw her standing beneath the torii gate, her form shimmering like a reflection on water. She wasn't hollow or menacing anymore. Her face, though faint, carried a soft, grateful smile. And then she was gone. Marcus walked away from the alley, the hum of the city returning in full force. The weight of the past still lingered, but it was no longer a burden. Yumi's story had been told, and her spirit had found release. But as he stepped into the bustling streets of Shinjuku, he couldn't help but glance at his camera. The lens glinted in the neon light, a quiet reminder that some stories still lingered in the shadows, waiting to be uncovered. Thank you for joining us tonight for The Ghost in the Frame, the first chapter in our Terror Abroad series. Set against the backdrop of Tokyo's neon-lit streets and shadowed alleys, this story reminds us that the past never truly vanishes. It lingers, waiting to be remembered. Yumi's tale is one of betrayal, loss, and justice found in the most unlikely of ways. In uncovering her story, Marcus gave her the peace she sought, but the echoes of her presence remind us that some truths demand to be told, no matter how deeply they are buried. If you enjoyed tonight's exploration into the paranormal, be sure to subscribe to Scarelax. We'll continue bringing you chilling tales from around the world, each rooted in the legends and folklore of their origins. Until then, stay curious, stay vigilant, and, as always, sleep well. Good night.